Andrea Garcia was only 19 years old in 1941 when her life was irreversibly altered by the cold machinery of the California Eugenics program. She was a teenager like any other, caught between the responsibilities of adulthood and the remnants of childhood, but in the eyes of the state she was not seen as a young woman with dreams, potential, or even basic rights. Instead, she was branded with a label that would dictate her fate: mentally deficient. That single designation was all it took for authorities to justify cutting away her ability to bear children forever, without her informed consent, without her understanding, and without compassion. The United States during this period was still deeply entrenched in eugenics ideology, a pseudoscience that had convinced politicians, scientists, and doctors that certain lives were more valuable than others. California was its most enthusiastic champion. By the time Andrea Garcia entered the system, the state had already sterilized thousands of people considered unfit, with Latinas and other minorities disproportionately targeted. The language used, unfit, feeble-minded, deficient, was vague enough to allow for abuse. And it was that vague authority that sealed Andrea's fate. Her mother fought against it, pleading that her daughter was not what officials claimed her to be. She saw Andrea as a young woman still finding her place in life, not someone deserving of this irreversible punishment. But mothers' voices carried little weight in the halls of institutions where doctors, social workers, and judges worked hand in hand with eugenics boards. Once the stamp of mentally deficient had been placed on Andrea's record, the decision was already made. She was marked. Andrea was institutionalized, confined in an asylum where she was subjected to routine examinations and assessments that often had little grounding in fairness. These so-called evaluations were designed to confirm pre-existing biases, rather than to uncover truth. Questions about her memory, intelligence, or behavior were filtered through the lens of a system already determined to strip her of her reproductive autonomy. When the decision was finalized, Andrea was scheduled for sterilization surgery, a procedure that would take from her the ability to ever bear children of her own. Imagine what that must have felt like for her. 19 years old, not fully understanding what was about to happen, not given the chance to consent. In the sterile, impersonal environment of the institution, she was reduced to a case number, a patient file, another deficient individual to be processed. She may have clutched at hope that her mother's protest would save her, that anyone would intervene. But the procedure went forward, as so many others had, in silence and without mercy. The sterilization itself was presented by doctors as a simple medical act, but its implications were devastating. For Andrea, the operation was not a cure, not a treatment, but a deliberate denial of her humanity. She was young, a Latina, and caught at the intersection of discrimination and power, where poor and minority women were most often selected for these surgeries. She had been chosen not because of who she was, but because of what she represented to a system obsessed with controlling population and dictating whose lives were worthy of continuing. Her mother's legal attempts to fight back highlight just how powerless families were. Once the state decided someone should be sterilized, she argued that her daughter was not deficient, that she was being unjustly targeted. But in the cold framework of the law, eugenic statutes were written with enough authority to silence dissent. Courts upheld the procedures again and again, citing previous rulings and the supposed benefits to society of eliminating undesirable traits. Andrea's case, like many others, was swept aside under this justification. Andrea's ordeal symbolizes more than her own tragedy. It stands as a representation of the thousands of lives altered by California's sterilization policies. By 1941, the state had sterilized over 10,000 people, more than any other state in the nation. While eugenics had been popular nationwide, California's embrace of it was unmatched, and Andrea became part of that grim statistic. Each of those individuals was a person with their own identity, their own sense of self, but the records reduced them to medicalized categories: feeble-minded, mentally ill, delinquent. Andrea's name, like so many others, became attached to a label rather than her humanity. The brutality of her sterilization was not in physical violence alone, though the surgery itself carried risk and pain. It was in the calculated stripping away of her choices, her future, her autonomy. It was the psychological torment of being told she was unworthy of motherhood, unfit to pass on her genes, and dangerous to society's progress. She was robbed of the possibility of creating a family, a decision made by strangers who would never see her as anything more than a problem to be solved. For Andrea, the aftershocks of this ordeal would have lasted a lifetime. Even if she tried to move forward, to live as best as she could, she would carry with her the knowledge of what had been taken, the possibility of children, grandchildren, the natural milestones of family life gone. Not by choice, but by decree. Her story exposes the cruelty of a system that claimed to act in the name of science and progress, while in truth it perpetuated control, discrimination, and punishment. Her case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how America treated its most vulnerable citizens. The image of a young Latina, confined in an asylum, stripped of her rights, highlights the way race, class, and gender intersected with state power. She was not unique in her suffering, but her story resonates because it personalizes a larger atrocity. By focusing on Andrea's experience, we are reminded that behind every statistic was a person with a face, a family, and a future that was stolen. Andrea's tragedy also shows how powerless young women were when targeted by the state. 19 years old, an age when life should be opening up with possibilities, she was instead confined and sterilized. Her mother's voice was not enough to protect her. Her own voice was dismissed, and the machinery of eugenics moved forward without pause. What happened to her is more than history. It is a warning about what happens when society allows prejudice and pseudoscience to masquerade as justice. This was the reality for Andrea Garcia, and for countless others whose names never even made it into the public record. A generation of young people, disproportionately poor and minority, were silenced through sterilization surgeries. Their lives were dictated not by their dreams, but by the prejudices of those in power. Andrea's ordeal is remembered today because it speaks to the cruel efficiency with which the system operated, leaving behind scars that could never heal. Andrea's ordeal is remembered today because it speaks to the cruel efficiency with which the system operated, leaving behind scars that could never heal. But her story did not end with the moment she was sterilized. What followed was a lifetime shaped by silence, shame, and an unspoken grief that shadowed her every day. For Andrea Garcia, like so many others, the act of sterilization was not just a medical procedure, it was the theft of possibility, the denial of motherhood, of choice, of autonomy. It was the state stamping out her humanity with the cold language of science and progress. In the years after her sterilization, Andrea remained in institutional care for a time. Records note her as improved, yet she was never the same. To the authorities, she was another statistic in California's war against what they called mental defectives. To her family, she was a daughter whose future had been taken away by a system more powerful than they could fight. Her mother, who had begged the courts for justice, lived with the guilt of failure, her pleas falling on deaf ears. Her daughter's fate sealed by laws that valued control over compassion. By the mid-20th century, sterilization under eugenics laws was spreading rapidly across the United States, but California was its most enthusiastic practitioner. Andrea's tragedy was part of a wider story of systemic targeting. Latino youth were disproportionately institutionalized, labeled feeble-minded or delinquent without due process. These labels carried the weight of final judgment, often decided by school officials, social workers, or doctors whose biases went unchecked. Once the label was applied, the system closed in. Court hearings, if they happened at all, were quick. Appeals were rare. Families were silenced. By the time Andrea Garcia was sterilized in 1941, California had perfected its machinery of reproductive control. For Andrea, Her life after the asylum was not documented in much detail. She fades into history, another victim of a system that destroyed personal futures while pretending to safeguard societies. We do not know whether she tried to build a family, whether she confided her secret to those closest to her, or whether she carried her pain in silence. But the absence of her voice is itself a haunting reminder of what was stolen. Imagine, for a moment, a 19-year-old girl being told that she would never be allowed to have children. The finality of those words, the invasive pain of the operation, the humiliation of being treated not as a human being, but as a defect to be eliminated. Andrea was one of thousands who endured the moment, each one a life reshaped by the same brutal hand of eugenics. The echoes of Andrea's story carried far beyond her own lifetime. In the decades after, the movement that sterilized her continued until the 1970s, even after the horrors of Nazi Germany forced the world to confront the dangers of eugenic ideology. California's program survived to world wars, multiple governors, and generations of families. The cruelty of Andrea Garcia. As sterilization was not an isolated event, it was part of a state-sanctioned strategy, one supported by some of the most powerful figures in California's government and academia. Even after the formal end of eugenics laws, forced sterilization did not vanish. It mutated, reappearing in prisons, immigration detention centers, and hospitals where poor women and women of color were pressured, coerced, or deceived into sterilization. Andrea Garcia's ordeal lives on, repeated across time, reminding us how fragile human rights can be when prejudice disguises itself as progress. Today, Andrea's story has been reconstructed from archives and court records. Her name appears not just as a victim, but as a symbol. Advocacy groups fighting for reproductive justice use her case to demonstrate the dangers of unchecked state power. For Latina activists, her story resonates as a reminder of how deeply racism and sexism were woven into the policies of California. For historians, Andrea Garcia is proof that the victims of eugenics were not abstract, they were young, vulnerable, real people whose lives were shattered. But perhaps most chilling of all is how recent her story really is. Andrea Garcia was sterilized in 1941, not the Middle Ages, not some distant past, but within living memory of our grandparents. This was America, land of the free performing acts of cruelty, indistinguishable from torture, and justifying them with medical jargon. Andrea's life is also a cautionary tale about silence. For decades, victims of sterilization were unable to speak, their shame enforced by stigma and secrecy. Families avoided the subject, survivors rarely told their stories. It was only in recent years, through the persistence of researchers and activists, that Andrea Garcia's ordeal has been brought back into the light. Her silence speaks volumes about the deep psychological wounds inflicted by eugenics. She was not only sterilized physically, she was sterilized socially, erased from the right to speak, the right to fight back, the right to be remembered. The weight of Andrea's case cannot be overstated. Her sterilization was one of thousands, yet it represents the humanity stripped away by a state system that wielded medicine as a weapon. The hands that held her down were not those of executioners with axes, or soldiers with rifles. They were doctors in white coats, nurses with clipboards, judges with gavels. And that makes her story perhaps even more chilling, because the people who hurt Andrea Garcia did so under the guise of care. Andrea Garcia's ordeal forces us to ask difficult questions. How many lives were reshaped? How many families never born? Because of California's obsession with purity? How many mothers wept, like Andrea's, after losing the chance to see their daughters carry forward a lineage? How many victims died in silence, their names forgotten, their pain unacknowledged? Her story is a wound in American history, a wound that demands remembrance. Because remembering Andrea Garcia is more than honoring her. It is a refusal to let the cruelty of the past vanish into silence. It is a commitment to recognizing the humanity of every person who endured the knife of eugenics. And it is a warning to the present that whenever a state claims the right to control bodies in the name of science, progress, or protection, It walks a dangerous path that leads back to the same horrors Andrea Garcia lived. This is the story of Andrea Garcia, a 19-year-old Latina whose voice was silenced, whose future was stolen, whose body was taken from her by force. She lived in a time when science was used not to heal, but to harm. Her name, and the names of thousands like her, are etched into the dark record of America's eugenics era. And now, their stories are being told. Remember Andrea Garcia. Remember the silence she was forced to endure. Remember the cruelty that was hidden in plain sight. Because history's darkest chapters are not meant to be forgotten, they are meant to haunt us, to remind us what must never be repeated. You've been watching Torture's Room, Real Torture, Real History. If Andrea Garcia's story has shaken you, if it has opened your eyes to the horrors hidden beneath America's past, then make sure you subscribe, share, and spread these stories. The only way to honor the victims is to speak their names, to shine light into the shadows, and to ensure that their pain was not endured in vain.